Good morning, everyone. The
Good
Gemara
morning.
that we learned yesterday, we spoke about the law of pas palter and pas akum, bread from either from a non-Jewish baker or bread from a non-Jew, non-Jewish homeowner. And we spoke about the law that from a non-Jewish homeowner is, is a decree that we're not allowed to have bread from a non-Jewish homeowner. But regarding a baker, there is some leniency, and it has to do with the fact that either the decree that was initially established was either not accepted on the entire Jewish people or it was later annulled. And that is regarding the baker, the bread of a non-Jewish baker, the fact that, it's something that people needed in order to live on. They need bread. And if you live in a community, people lived in communities that didn't necessarily have a bakery, a Jewish bakery, and so they needed to rely on non-Jewish bakers. So there obviously is there definitely is leniency regarding a bread baked by a non-Jew. And as I mentioned yesterday, that doesn't mean that you could just buy bread from a non-Jewish bakery. Obviously, it's after checking the ingredients and checking the oven that they don't cook other stuff, bake other stuff in the oven at the same, it's an oven that's only for bread, and it's only all the ingredients are all kosher and all their breads and so on. And that's what that's in that scenario, there might be leniency to have non-Jewish bread, so to speak, kosher, but not baked by a Jew. And even that is really a leniency because obviously bread baked by a Jew is ideal. And the reason why the rabbis established this rule is because to separate socially from the non-Jews, that we shouldn't get too close, and it would lead, God forbid, to intermarriage. So the discussion really in the Shulchan Aruch about it is what happens if you live near a place where there is available bread from a Jewish baker. Can you still rely on this leniency? Because once it's permitted, or is it only in a case where you need the leniency? And this is an argument that seems between the Shulchan Aruch in the Ramah. The Sephardic opinion would be more strict. The Ashkenazic would seem to be more lenient, but even the Ashkenazic leniency is not so simple, because the commentaries on the Ramah, like the Shach, the Sifsei Koyin, he mentions that really you should still be strict like the Shulchan Aruch, and even if even though you have this leniency, but really it's only you should only use it when you really need it. If you have available bread baked by a Jew, you should really be eating bread baked by a Jew. The Shulchan Aruch, Mishnah Berurah brings regarding Shabbos that, of course, on Shabbos, even if you rely on the leniency during the week, for sure, for Shabbos, you should try to be more strict and have bread challah baked by a Jew. And we know the famous law in Shulchan Aruch that everyone knows is between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. That's for sure a time to eat only Pas Yisrael, bread baked by a Jew, even though throughout the year one might be lenient. But between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, of course, that's a time to be more strict and be careful and extra careful and especially the reason being because it's a time between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur we're being judged. So it's a time to be extra careful and mitzvahs extra, maybe beyond the letter of the law even. There is a leniency that is quoted that if the bread from the non-Jewish bakery is is a better bread, so there's room for leniency there. There's room for leniency in huge commercial bakeries versus local bakeries. There might be more room for leniency in like the huge commercial bakeries, but ultimately, you have these two views, and obviously, if you live in an area where it's very simple for you to get bread baked by a Jew, it would seem like it's a no-brainer. Yes, Ben?
I'm thinking maybe the leniency for Ashkenazi was because we don't eat pita as much as the Sephardi. They make, if they don't have kosher bread, they'll make a pita. It doesn't take much to make a pita.
Sounds interesting. I don't know. You're saying home.
I don't know any Ashkenazi that goes out, makes a fire, and bakes a pita.
But the Sephardic people do that on their own, or is that only like big
stores?
Sure. Every
really? Can do it. Yeah.
In a regular Sephardic household,
I even saw a video where Israeli guy is showing how to make a pita, how to bake a pita. Anywhere. Right. He says, like when you are on the road, and it was very simple.
Okay, sounds good. We're going to take you when we go hiking. We're going to take you along.
I'll do it.
But yeah, no, it's an interesting thought based on the practicality and the tradition. But the views are the views are there in Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch interestingly talks about a scenario where a person is himself careful to eat pas Yisrael, only bread baked by a Jew, but his household or his guests are having bread baked by a non-Jew. This is a very interesting case. The bread baked by, in other words, he's careful. He's extra careful to only eat bread baked by a Jew, but he's got people in his household who are going to be eating bread in this meal, bread baked by a non-Jew. And in the tradition was that one person recites the Hamaitzi for everyone. So in the Shulchan Aruch, it says, this is in chapter 168, if the Baal Habayis is careful not to eat this type of bread, but the people that are sitting with him, they're not as strict. So the mitzvah is to cut the better bread, and because he's the Baal Habayis, he's the owner of the household, he's supposed to recite the bracha for everyone, and this is a better bread, maybe because it's complete or for other reasons, maybe taste better. So whatever the case is, that he should cut that bread, even though he's normally very strict not to eat this bread. He should cut this bread, make the hamaitzi, recite the hamaitzi on this bread and eat it, even though he's normally strict, which I think is an interesting law because he's going against his regular policy. And in order to recite the bracha for everyone else on the better food, the Rama adds in, this is only if that bread is actually chaviv, it's like cherished. But if not, then he wouldn't need to have this non-Jewish baked bread. But we're dealing with obviously a non-Jewish baked bread, a non-Jew that baked this bread, but it's a very good bread. It's maybe like a sourdough or some other special bread that might be attractive, exciting. So that bread, because he has household members that he's reciting the hamaitzi for, that would be a scenario where he would be not only allowed but encouraged to eat that bread. That wouldn't apply during the week when we all recite our own hamaitzi. We don't have one person reciting hamaitzi for everyone, but the case that this is talking about is where one person recites hamaitzi for everyone would be like on a Shabbos meal or something or so. Now, this source of this halacha seems to be our Tosfos that we mentioned yesterday. We mentioned, or 2 days ago, we mentioned that Rabbeinu Shimshon, he used to take the non-Jewish baked bread off his table in order to recite the hamaitzi. And the reason he did that seemingly was because he was, or at least one way of understanding it is, he would take that off because he didn't want to rely on this leniency. And therefore he took off that bread, and therefore he only had a bread baked by a Jew on his table, and that's why he recited the bracha on the Jewish bread, because he took the other bread off. Because if he didn't, it would maybe be an obligation for him to recite the bracha on the non-Jewish baked bread, which, although Shulchan Aruch allows, it seems he was more careful and didn't want to rely on that leniency. So he would have them take it off. Now, the Mishnah Berurah mentions we're dealing with a guest, and because of the guest, they allowed the owner, the household owner, to do this. But if it wasn't a guest, he would not be allowed to do such a thing, but rather take it off. So what it seems like maybe then is that Rabbeinu Shimshon, it wasn't just because he didn't want to rely on this leniency, it was because he didn't have guests, he had household members. So for household members that were lenient, maybe there is no, that's the way to do it. Take it off the table, and then you don't have to recite the bracha on it. But for guests, then it would be a mitzvah of honoring your guests. That's why that would be encouraged to recite the bracha, even going against your policy, because according to the letter of the law, this is permitted. Now, the Mishnah Berurah then mentions what I mentioned, that nowadays everyone recites their own hamaitzi, so this law would not apply. Each person recites their own hamaitzi, but maybe it would apply if you have guests that don't recite brachas, and therefore they're just going to say amen, or on a Shabbos where maybe it's your tradition is to have it, is to that one person recites the hamaitzi for everyone. Now, the Gemara that we learned, it said an interesting thing. It said that a Yarei Shamayim, someone that fears heaven, should try to fulfill both views. So let's think about this for a moment. We brought an argument between Rav Huna and Rabbi Yochanan, and this is something new. We didn't mention this before. We mentioned the Gemara, but now we're going to connect the two parts of the Gemara. The earlier Gemara mentioned an argument, Rav Huna and Rabbi Yochanan. You had this solid loaf, and you have these pieces of bread. And Rav Huna said, the way Rashi learned, was you can recite the bracha on either the pieces or the full loaf, the whole loaf. According to Rav Huna, you don't have to recite the bracha on the shalem, on the complete one. Rabbi Yochanan said that it's a mitzvah min hamuvchar, it's a better mitzvah to recite the bracha on the shalem. You should recite the bracha on the complete bread. So let's think for a moment. If you want to fulfill both views, and you have two breads in front of you, you have a half a loaf and you have a complete loaf, and you want to fulfill both views, Rav Huna and Rabbi Yochanan, what should you do? You have two loaves in front of you. One is a half a loaf, one is a whole loaf. Maybe they're the same size, let's say they're the same size. So how do you fulfill both views? Rav Huna says you recite the bracha on whichever one you want. Rabbi Yochanan says you have to recite it on the whole loaf. So how do you fulfill both views? Can you fulfill both views? Anyone? Again, Rav Huna says you recite it on either one, either the half or the whole. Rabbi Yochanan says you have to recite it on the whole. So if you want to fulfill both views, what do, Susan?
You just pick up both breads.
You recite it on the...
Okay, Susan says recite it on both breads. Simone, did you want to say something? Anyone?
Yes. Since Rav Huna said you can say it on either one, that you say it on the whole loaf, and that fulfills both Rav Huna and Rav Yochanan.
Yes. So what Susan said is what the Gemara says. What Simone said is logical. If you want to recite fulfill both views, one of them said you do either the whole or the half, and the other one said you have to do the whole. So you can fulfill both views by just doing the whole, right? So what does the Gemara mean later that you have to put both together? So there's another way of learning. There's another point that has to be added here. And the other point is that what happens if you have a loaf that is larger? If you have a loaf, I'm sorry, a half a loaf that is larger than the whole loaf. So you have let's say like a rye bread. You could have a 2-pound rye bread or a 1 pound. So if you have a 2-pound rye bread that is a piece was cut off of it. So this is a half a loaf or a portion of a loaf that's not whole, but it's bigger than the 1 pound rye bread. We're talking about that's whole. It wasn't sliced. So you have a 1 pound whole rye bread, or you have a piece of a 2 pound rye bread, a very large piece of a 2 pound rye bread. It's 1.5 pounds now because you cut off a half of it, but it's cut off a quarter of it, but it's larger than the complete one. So in this scenario, Rav Huna, who initially said you could recite on either one, either the half or the whole, here in this scenario, where one of them is bigger, Rav Huna will say recite it on the bigger one. So what we have here is, if you have a big portion of a loaf and you have a small complete loaf, Rav Huna says recite it on the portion of the loaf because it's bigger, and Rabbi Yochanan says recite it on the small loaf because it's whole. And if you want to use terminology, I would use one is quality and one is quantity. According to Rav Huna, you follow the quantity. It's much larger. According to Rabbi Yochanan, you follow the quality, which is that it's whole. It has a wholeness to it. So it has a better quality to it. It looks nicer. And on the other hand, the other one is bigger. So the other one is quantity. So according to Rav Huna, you're supposed to recite the bracha on the larger one. According to Rabbi Yochanan, recite the bracha on the According to Rabbi Yochanan, you recite the bracha on the smaller, the whole one. Now, we follow Rabbi Yochanan's view. The halacha really follows Rabbi Yochanan. But later in the Gemara, it says, if you want to follow both views, there is a way. And this is the scenario where the Gemara is talking. How can you follow both views? Rav Huna says you have to use the broken piece because it's larger. And Rabbi Yochanan says you have to use the smaller piece because it's whole, the smaller loaf because it's whole. So how do you do both? So Susan, why don't you tell us, how can you do both if you, one of them says do the small one and one of them, the small whole one, and the other one says do the large partial one? How do you do both?
You just pick up both of them, one on top of the other.
Right, you pick up both of them, one on top of the other. So in a scenario where they're both the same size, you don't need to put them both together. No. Because in that scenario, you just pick the one you pick the if you want to follow both views, you would just use the whole one and everyone would agree that that's fine. But in a scenario where one of them is where the broken one is larger than the whole one, so if you want to follow both views, even though the main view is the shalem, is the complete view, because Rabbi Yochanan is the teacher and his colleague's student is the other one who argues on him, Rav Huna, who's the student of Rav. So it turns out that the halacha would follow Rabbi Yochanan. So the main view would be that you eat the complete loaf. But if you want, but in order to follow both views, as it says, Yarei Shamayim, someone who fears heaven, he follows both views. So in that scenario, he would put both together, as Susan says, and therefore you would cut. Rashi tells us either only the shalem, only the complete one, or you would cut both the complete one and the broken one. Now that's the way Rashi learned the Gemara. Now the way Tosfos learns the Gemara, it ends up being a little different if you follow through to the end. The way Tosfos learned the Gemara is that Rav Huna does not believe that you recite the bracha on the larger one. Rav Huna says you could recite the bracha on either the piece or on the whole one. Whichever one you want. Okay, so you have a large piece and you have a whole small. The way Taisus learns, the argument is, in that scenario, Rav Huna says you can recite it on either one, and Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you need to recite the bracha on the whole small one. So if that's the argument, if that's the case of the argument, according to the way Taisus is learning, how can you fulfill both views? Again, Rav Huna says you recite the bracha on either. Rav Huna says you recite the bracha on either the large broken one or on the small whole one. You can do either one. And Rabbi Yochanan says you recite the bracha on the smaller whole one. So how do you fulfill both views according to that way of learning? Yes, Ben.
I didn't want to answer your question, but I can't see where Rabbi Huna says that you can bless on either one of them.
Either one.
He says you can bless on the smaller one, and it poters the big one. So how did Tosfos get to the other idea? I don't know.
Well, not only is your question on Tosfos, your question is on Rashi.
Oh, Rashi, I'm sorry.
No, it's on both.
Oh, it's on both. Okay.
Your question is on both, because the way the Gemara says it, it sounds like, as Ben is saying, it sounds like you have to recite the bracha on the pieces, right? Because that's what it says. You recite the bracha on the pieces, on the pesisin, and mevarech. What's the wording of Rav Huna? Mevarech ala pesisin. You recite the bracha on the pesisin. It sounds like you have to, but both Rashi and Tosfos learn that it doesn't mean you have to. It means you can. That's how they learn the Gemara. They both learn it that way. Rashi happens to add an interesting point that if the piece is larger, then you would need to recite it on the piece. But that's not the case that according to Rashi, that it's talking about. It's talking about a case where they're equal size. And it says that you can recite it on the broken one. And Rashi adds in, by the way, if it's larger, then Rav Huna would hold you have to recite it on the larger. So either Rashi or both Rashi and Tosfos are both learning that when the Gemara says you recite the bracha on the pesisin, it really means you can recite it on the pesisin, not that you have to. And that's arguing with Rabbi Yochanan, who says you have to recite it on the whole. Rav Huna says no, you don't have to recite it on the whole. You can recite it on the pesisin. That's the way they're learning the case. I'm not sure. Yes, Ben.
I see that Rav Huna cares about what the people feel about the bread. He doesn't want to throw out the pieces. He wants to eat it first before you cut the full one. Because otherwise you'll have both of them in pieces if you don't finish the other one.
That would be a good
explanation. You're going to eat.
That would be a good explanation if we translated it differently than Rashi and Tosfos.
Right.
And we translated it that you have to eat the broken. But they're not translating it that way. And
but some people are just blessing for themselves when they eat by themselves, and they don't want to eat, throw out the pieces. So they want to eat the pieces first and save the whole one for the next time.
Right. So in your scenario, the halacha would actually be, as you're saying, that if you don't plan on eating both, then there's no question. We don't have to worry. There's no question of preference in brachas, because you're not planning on eating the other item. You don't have to eat every single thing in your kitchen, even though some Americans think they're supposed to eat up their whole kitchen whenever they walk in. They're just the question is what to go first. But we have to eat everything in this meal. And so they go through the refrigerator, and then they go to the cabinet, and then they go back to the refrigerator and the freezer, and they continuously, it's like their job is to finish everything that's there. But that's not really the law.
To get some walking in too. So
What is
you go
that?
from you have to walk every day too. So you go from the cabinet to the refrigerator.
Right. That's the exercise of the day. Yeah. The opening and closing. But the thing is that according to halacha,
So if you don't going to eat just the pieces,
then there's no problem. Then of course you recite the bracha in pieces. We're talking about a case where you're eating both, and the question is where to recite the bracha and to exempt the other. So you're going to be eating both, and you're going to want to exempt the other. And here, the way Rashi and Tosfos both learn is that the Rav Huna's opinion is that you can recite the bracha on the pieces. Rashi adds an interesting point, which argues with Tosfos, and that is that if the pieces are larger than the whole, you must recite the bracha on the piece, and that is where the Gemara later will say that when you want to follow both views, you would need to put them together and recite the bracha on the whole, and then you could either only cut the whole or cut both, the whole and the piece. But ultimately, you're following Rabbi Yochanan's view, but you're including the view of Rav Huna as well. That was Rashi. Now, Tosfos argues. Tosfos says if the piece is larger than the whole, Rav Huna says, even in that case, you have both options. You could cut the whole or you could cut the piece. It's up to you. Rabbi Yochanan says you have to cut the whole. You have to recite the bracha on the whole and cut the whole one because the whole one is more honorable. Now, if you want to fulfill both views, how do you fulfill both views according to Tosfos?
Put them all together.
So Ezra says put them all together. And anyone else? Again, Rav Huna said you could do whatever you want. You could either cut the piece of loaf that's large, or you could cut the small whole one. That's Rav Huna. And Rabbi Yochanan says you have to cut the small whole one. So how do you fulfill both views?
So in this case, you cut the small one because then Rav Huna said,
right, the small whole one seems good enough.
Cut the small whole.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. So it seems that in the way Tosfos is learning, you have a scenario here where it's no big deal to fulfill both views. Because Rav Huna has no problem. If you want to cut the whole small one, you can. Because according to the way Tosfos is learning, the whole small one is fine, even according to Rav Huna. So why does the Gemara say then that if you want to fulfill both views, a Yarei Shamayim, someone who fears God, has to put them both together? What do you mean put them both together? I don't need to put them both together. I could just take the small whole one and I fulfill Rabbi Yochanan's view for sure, because Rabbi Yochanan said, oh, you need a whole, and I could do that. And Rav Huna says, you do both. You do either, whatever you want. You could do the half, you could do the whole, whatever you want. It's up to you. So I could fulfill both views if I just do the small whole one, according to Tosfos. So what is the Gemara later on saying? That you put the piece into the whole one, and that's how you fulfill the mitzvah. So that's how you recite the bracha. So the way Tosfos learns later, he has to learn a different explanation because it doesn't flow the way we learned in Rashi. The way we learned with Rashi's view, it fit. We talked about a case where you have a large piece and a small whole one, and you're going to need to put both together to fulfill both views. According to Rashi, to fulfill both views, you got to put them both together because Rav Huna held you need to use the large piece. And Rabbi Yochanan said, you need to use the small one. So how do you fulfill both? You got to put them both together. According to Tosfos, Rav Huna says you could do either one, the large piece or the small whole, whatever you want. Rabbi Yochanan says you have to use the small whole. You don't need to put them both together. Just use the small whole. So Tosfos has to learn a different explanation later when it says you want to fulfill both. How does he learn? That we're talking about the next line of the Gemara. The next line of the Gemara said that what happens if you have wheat and barley? So if you have wheat or barley, the Gemara had said that when you have a piece of wheat and a complete one of barley, so we said that everyone agrees you recite a bracha on the piece of wheat bread, instead of the whole loaf of barley, and you exempt the barley. The problem is that you really want to honor the bracha with something whole. And on the other hand, the bracha, of course, goes to the wheat before the barley, but the wheat is only a piece. So on this, the Gemara says that if you want to fulfill both the concept of whole and the concept of wheat coming before the barley, in order to fulfill both of these ideas, you should put them both together. So by putting them both together, you're getting the barley, the case of barley was, so this is not the argument exactly of Rav Huna and Rav Yochanan. This is not exactly the case where they argued, because they really agreed in this scenario that Rav Yochanan had to give in to the idea that you don't recite the bracha on the whole, because wheat in the verse comes before barley. So really the bracha should be on the wheat, because that's the more honorable thing in the bracha, but it's only a piece, and the barley is a whole loaf. So on this, Tosfos explains in Gemara later that you want to fulfill both, you put them both together. You put the barley and the wheat together, and so you have a whole loaf of barley, and you have a partial loaf of wheat, or a piece of wheat bread, and you put them both together, and this way the bracha is on both the whole and the wheat. You have the whole barley and the wheat, and this way you have fulfilled both of these concepts with your bracha. So that's what it means. A Yarei Shamayim fulfills both. So again, Rashi learned that it's going on just we're not differentiating wheat or barley. We're talking about a regular. They're both the same. They're both wheat, and one of them is whole. One of them is a large piece. And on that, Rashi learned that's where you have you fulfill both. Tosfos learns that we're talking about wheat and barley, and you would put them both together so that you'll have a whole loaf and of barley with a piece of wheat, and that's why you want to put them both together. So that's the explanation. That's how the Gemara flows from the earlier argument to the later conclusion of the Gemara. Okay, we got two questions here. I see Susan.
I just want to make sure wheat and oats are the same status, correct?
No, wheat is much more the preferred than barley, and for sure than oats, which is only considered a type of barley.
Oh,
like
so what's number two? Is after wheat, what's number two?
Barley.
I see. Okay.
First is wheat, then is barley.
Okay.
And within, yes, Ezra.
No.
Okay.
I have a
No
question.
Yes, Simone.
Yeah, so if got your barley and your wheat loaves, and you make the bracha on both of them together, which one do you take a bite of first?
Which one do you slice? So Rashi had learned, this is a debate among the commentaries, is how to learn Tosfos, because Tosfos leaves you hanging over there. He doesn't tell you which one to cut. Rashi tells you could cut either, you must cut the whole, and if you want, you could also cut the piece, but definitely you have to cut the whole. Tosfos leaves you hanging. He doesn't really clarify which one to cut. And the commentaries, they discuss this. They talk about this. Let me tell you what they say. Some say that you specifically break the piece of wheat bread, because of course that's the one, according to the letter of the law, that's the one you're supposed to do. That's all you need. But the Shulchan Aruch seems to follow the other view that you need to break both. You should break both, and you have the whole loaf on top, and then you cut the other one. So that answers your question. Of course, it's an argument, and but you should cut both. Ben.
I wanted to say the reason you have to cut both is so you don't have a bracha lebatala. You want to eat
No.
from both of them.
No, it's not a bracha levatala. Why would it be a bracha in vain? You have to recite a bracha. You have to have in mind both. And
If
you're
you
going to eat one.
bless something and don't eat from it, I thought
No.
it would be bracha lebatala.
Yeah, it would be if you don't eat from either of them. But you're for sure going to eat from one of them. The only question is which one are you? Which one are you reciting which one are you eating from?
That's good
when
enough.
when you recite the bracha, as long as you recite it from one. If you're holding 20 pieces of bread in your hand and you recite a bracha, you don't have to eat all 20 pieces. You know what I mean? You eat one piece. So if you're holding both in your hand, you for sure it's not a bracha lebatala. It's not a bracha in vain if you eat one of the things that you're holding. Yeah. Okay, everyone, have a wonderful day.
You too, Rabbi.
See you later, Mr. Shem. Sei gesund.